chapter 17. We're in Thessalonica, and Paul and Silas and some traveling companions who are unnamed, but we're pretty sure Luke was not among them. It was their custom, Luke writes, that they went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and Paul spoke about Jesus as the fulfillment of the prophecies of what these Jews had as their Bible, which is our Old Testament. Okay, he said, "This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah." Now, some Jews in the synagogue gathering, they believed. They were persuaded. Here's how Luke says it. This is verse 4. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. Verse 5. But other Jews were jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. What is wrong with you people? There's something about jealousy that overwhelms rationality on any and every level. Do you see the pattern here? Paul and his traveling companions seek out a synagogue. And in a synagogue, you didn't say, I'd like to deliver a message today. If you were a guest, it was traditional to ask if you'd like to say a few words. Paul did want to say a few words, and actually probably more than a few. But his message was at first received well. But in every case, it seems like, majority anyway, the Jews who didn't accept the message, not only did they not accept it, but they stirred things up. Remember that in Iconium, or Lystra rather, they had stoned Paul. Here in Thessalonica, they created a riot. They went out and procured some, this is Luke's words, are some bad characters. I mean, these would be, they would have been criminals. There's a lot of questions I have about this that there's no good answer for. But the biggest thing is, how could these Jews justify in their minds doing this? The capstone, cornerstone and capstone idea for all the Jews, they recited this verse from Deuteronomy chapter 6 every day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. How does rounding up bad characters from the marketplace, forming a mob, and starting a riot fit with that? They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. So they just had this traveling mob. They rushed to Jason's house I from this, I think we get the idea, or I get the idea, that it was known that Paul and Silas were guests of Jason's. Verse 6, but when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, these men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decree, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. They're big old fat liars. Their pants ought to be on fire. If anybody should have had charges brought against them, it should have been these Jews who incited the riot. Silas didn't incite the riot. And then they bend the truth. These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here. They didn't cause trouble all over the world. I will admit they encountered resistance, adversity in a number of places, but there wasn't a riot every time they came into a town. But that's the inference, that's the message that these Jews spewed out to the magistrates, the city officials. And then they throw Jason under the bus. Jason has welcomed these people in his house. So he would be, he's aiding and abetting. And then, now this is the biggest lie. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. Well, yes, they were proclaiming Jesus as the king, as the Messiah. But they weren't defying. We never hear of Paul or Silas or any of the message that these two brought in any way being in defiance of Caesar and Caesar's decrees. These are simply lies. Okay, let's be realistic here. This approach is not new. And people who are eaten up with jealousy, bitterness, and it had moved to rage with these Jews, are going to be able to manufacture charges and stimulate violence. I'm not even going to make it a political thing, but just to say, anybody ever hear of a group called Antifa? I just think they're modern descendants of the Jews who did this thing to Paul and Silas and Jason. See, I think Jason gets left out. He doesn't get credit. If I had been Jason and they had a rioting mob, had dragged me out of my own house and drugged me to the city officials and thrown these accusations out, I think I'd be pretty, I can just tell you, I'd be having anxiety attacks. We don't know what Jason's status of mind was, but he didn't run from it. I'll give him every credit. Verse 8, when they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. I think part of what threw them into turmoil was just this out of the blue thing. The other is that this was a serious indictment that they had been defying Caesar's decrees. That was not a good thing to have happen in the Roman Empire. In verse 9, then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. Well, and that's the end of the story. There was no resolution to this thing. It's just that, all right, post bail, we don't know how much, but something. And usually bail is not, well, I guess it depends on what part of the country you're in, but the part of the world I live in, you're not just throwing a few bucks at it. It's costly. Well, it probably would have been for Jason and the others, which indicates that those who had been with Jason, the other believers with Jason, had been rounded up along with Jason. And then after they posted bail, they let him go. End of story. Really? No. The believers, the followers of Jesus in Thessalonica, continued to grow, and the church expanded, even under the threat that these Jews might do the same thing to them as they had done to Jason and intended to do to Paul and Silas. You see, I have a pretty strong feeling that had they been able to find Paul and Silas, the pattern for these jealous Jews was that they didn't really wait for the legal proceedings. I think they would have proceeded right onto their own form of punishment and violence toward Paul and Silas. I just don't have respect for that. The people who are, well, first of all, for these Jews, God loves them, and I'm supposed to love them too. I don't have high respect for what they did, and for their successors over history. I don't have respect for them. Okay, whatever. Verse 10, as soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. They knew what was going on, and they felt, oh, there's no reason to let this keep going on. We will send them. And that's almost like here's your hat, there's the door type thing. But in a way, Paul was used to this. This is not the first time this had happened to him. I don't think he went away in protest. But at night, why at night? So that they could sneak out unnoticed. Had they appeared in public, I'm convinced that these Jews, I think they had eyes pretty much everywhere. And if those eyes had seen Paul and Silas, I think the Jews would have fell on them, and who knows what would have happened. So under the cover of darkness, the believers in Thessalonica sent Paul and Silas away. And not just, you got to leave town. No, for some reason, either Paul said, we're going, or the believers said, we want you to go to Berea. So much that is not, that's not included in the narrative that I wish I knew more about. Well, that's the way life is. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.